The Man Who Knew Too Much. The Thomas Baron Mystery. The last testimony on the evening of April 27, 1967. A train collision at a railroad crossing in Mims, Florida, claimed 3 lives in an instant. Among the dead was Thomas Ronald Baron, a 29-year-old quality control inspector who, just 7 days earlier, had sat before Congress and delivered devastating testimony about America's race to the moon. His car had been struck by a Florida East Coast Railway switching locomotive. His wife and stepdaughter died beside him. The official ruling came swiftly: accidental death. Case closed. But for those who knew what Baron had witnessed, what he had documented, and what he had dared to speak aloud, the timing seemed too convenient, too precise, too final. In his possession had been a 500-page report, a comprehensive indictment of NASA's safety failures. After his death, that report vanished, never to be seen again. Was it truly an accident? Or had the U.S. government silenced its most vocal critic? The watchman at the gate. Thomas Ronald Baron was born around 1938. A working-class kid from Pennsylvania who enlisted in the U.S. Air Force and eventually found himself stationed at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. After his service, he was hired by North American Aviation, the prime contractor for NASA's Apollo Command Module, as a quality control and safety inspector. It was 1966, and the space race with the Soviet Union had reached fever pitch. President Kennedy's promise to land a man on the moon before the decade's end hung over NASA like both inspiration and ultimatum. Baron took his job seriously, perhaps too seriously. His role placed him inside the spacecraft assembly facilities at Kennedy Space Center, where he watched technicians build the very capsules that would carry American heroes beyond the atmosphere. What he saw disturbed him deeply. Day after day, Baron witnessed dangerous shortcuts, sloppy workmanship, and a culture that prioritized schedule over safety. He began documenting everything: workers drinking on the job, technicians unfamiliar with their equipment, a welder who accidentally started a fire, a damaged tank, fluid leaks that went unreported, specifications altered without authorization, defective parts installed anyway. Baron didn't just observe these failures, he meticulously recorded them, building a case file that grew thicker by the week. By December 1966, Baron's concerns had reached a boiling point. He approached a NASA employee with a warning that would prove chillingly prophetic. Something has to be done. Someone is going to get killed. No one listened. The prophecy fulfilled. January 26, 1967. Baron spoke with a newspaper editor. "I fear for the lives of the astronauts." The next day, his worst fears materialized. Launch Complex 34 at Cape Kennedy stood tall against the Florida sky on the afternoon of January 27, 1967. Inside the Apollo 1 command module sat 3 astronauts: Virgil Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. They were conducting a plugs-out test, a full simulation of launch procedures. The spacecraft was pressurized with pure oxygen at 16.7 pounds per square inch, creating a tinderbox where any spark would become an inferno. Grissom himself had expressed deep misgivings about the Apollo design. He had even hung a lemon on the spacecraft simulator, a symbol for equipment that doesn't work. The test had been plagued with problems from the start. Strange odors, communications failing repeatedly. At 6:30 p.m., Grissom's frustration burst through the radio. "How are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings?" 1 minute later, disaster struck. At 6:31 p.m., a power surge rippled through the electrical system. Seconds later, a voice from inside: "Fire!" Ed White's urgent transmission: "We've got a fire in the cockpit." Chaffee's desperate shout: "We have a bad fire." In the pure oxygen atmosphere, flames exploded through the cabin with apocalyptic fury. 17 seconds after the first indication of fire, all communication ceased. All telemetry went dead. Outside, technicians rushed toward the spacecraft but were driven back by waves of heat and smoke. The hatch design, an inward opening mechanism requiring multiple latches, had already doomed the crew. Under normal conditions, it took at least 90 seconds to open. With internal pressure mounting from the heat, it became physically impossible. By the time rescuers opened the hatch approximately 5 minutes later, all 3 astronauts were dead. They had perished within the first 30 seconds from smoke inhalation and burns. Their spacesuits had melted and fused to the spacecraft's interior. America's race to the moon had hit a wall of fire. The whistleblower's crusade. Thomas Baron already knew what had happened. He had warned them. He had documented the systemic failures that made such a disaster inevitable. But North American Aviation wasn't interested. After he leaked his initial 57-page report to the media in early 1967, detailing the safety violations he had witnessed, the company fired him. Baron was out of a job but far from finished. Unemployed and convinced that the Apollo 1 disaster could have been prevented, Baron threw himself into creating a comprehensive document. The new report grew to over 500 pages, a massive compendium of safety failures, protocol violations, and management negligence. The report was meticulous. It documented poor quality control standards, lack of proper safety protocols, unqualified workers, alcohol consumption on the job, unauthorized equipment modifications, defective parts knowingly installed, ignored fire hazards, communication breakdowns, pressure to meet deadlines at the expense of safety. Baron wasn't just criticizing North American aviation. His report implicated NASA itself, suggesting that the space agency's management culture prioritized political timelines over astronaut lives. In the Cold War context of 1967, with the Soviet Union's space program advancing, such accusations were explosive. Friends and family recalled that Baron became increasingly anxious during this period. He told associates he felt he was being watched. On April 21, 1967, he reported on camera that he and his wife had been harassed at their home. His voice carried the tension of a man who believed he was in danger, yet felt compelled to speak the truth regardless. The congressional testimony on April 21, 1967, Baron appeared before Representative Olin E. Teague's subcommittee investigating the Apollo 1 fire. It was his moment to be heard, to make his case directly to those with power to change things. Baron delivered his testimony with methodical precision. He outlined the systematic breakdowns he had witnessed. He spoke of a culture where corners were cut, where warnings were ignored, where the schedule mattered more than safety. When he mentioned his 500-page report, Representative Teague responded, "Your report went to the chairman of the full committee, not to me," adding that something of that length. "We can take it as an exhibit." The report was submitted to the committee. It entered the official record. At least that's what was supposed to happen. The NASA Oversight Committee chairman would later describe Baron as having made a valuable contribution to the probe, though he qualified this by calling Baron overzealous. Overzealous. The suggestion that his concerns were exaggerated, his fears overblown. But Baron's concerns had been vindicated by the charred remains of Apollo 1 and 3 dead astronauts. The night at the crossing, April 27, 1967. 6 days after Baron's testimony. The evening began like any other. Thomas was driving with his wife and her young daughter near their home in Mims, Florida, not far from Kennedy Space Center. At some point, they approached a railroad crossing. A Florida East Coast Railway switching locomotive, just a single-engine car, was approaching the same intersection. What happened next is where questions begin. According to the train conductor, he blew his whistle before impact. A woman named Linda Sue Mullins, allegedly traveling in the opposite direction, claimed she honked her horn frantically to warn Baron of the approaching train. Another witness, a man, refused to make any statement to investigating Florida Highway Patrol troopers. His silence was noted but never explained. The impact was catastrophic. Baron's Volvo was struck by the locomotive. All 3 occupants died instantly. The Florida Highway Patrol's accident report reached a conclusive determination. Accidental death. No suspicion of foul play, but questions lingered, growing louder as weeks passed. Why would Baron, a man obsessed with safety protocols, whose entire career was built on identifying hazards, try to beat a train across the tracks? It made no sense to those who knew him. Baron was cautious to a fault. He wasn't reckless. And even if he had misjudged, why would he risk the lives of his wife and her child? Baron loved his family. The train conductor said he blew his whistle. But at what distance? How loud was it? Linda Sue Mullins said she honked her horn. But Baron's car continued toward the tracks. Did he not hear her? Was he distracted? Or was something else happening? The male witness who refused to speak. Who was he? What did he see? Why wouldn't he give a statement? That silence, unexplained and uninvestigated, would fuel speculation for decades. And the timing. 7 days after Baron testified before Congress. 7 days after he submitted his 500-page report. 7 days after he became NASA's most visible critic. The disappearing evidence after Baron's death, his family and legal representatives sought to obtain a copy of his comprehensive report. They wanted to understand what Thomas had documented. But the report was gone. The 500-page document that Baron had spent months compiling, that he had personally delivered to the congressional investigation, had vanished. Congressional records showed it had been received. Baron's testimony mentioned it. Committee members acknowledged its existence. Yet no one could produce it. NASA officials claimed they never received a complete copy. Congressional staff couldn't locate it. North American aviation had no record of it. The document had simply disappeared from the official record. To this day, that report has never been found. Some investigators suggest it might have been inadvertently lost in the chaos of the investigation, misfiled among thousands of pages. Bureaucratic error, they argue, not conspiracy. Others find that explanation insufficient. A 500-page report doesn't simply get lost. It's a substantial physical object, likely bound, likely multiple copies. For every copy to disappear requires either remarkable incompetence or deliberate action. NASA's response and the shadow of silence. NASA's public response to Baron's death was muted. There were no official statements of condolence, no acknowledgement of his contributions, no reflection on the tragic irony of a safety inspector dying so soon after trying to prevent deaths. The space agency was in crisis mode. The Apollo 1 fire had devastated the program. Congressional investigations were ongoing. Public confidence was shaken. The last thing NASA needed was more controversy. In the months following Baron's death, NASA did implement sweeping changes. The command module was completely redesigned. The inward opening hatch was replaced. Flammable materials were removed. The pure oxygen ground test environment was eliminated. Safety protocols were overhauled. These changes undoubtedly saved lives. Baron's warnings, his documentation, his testimony, all contributed to making the Apollo program safer. Yet NASA never publicly credited Baron. His name doesn't appear in official NASA histories except in passing. There are no plaques honoring his whistleblowing. No exhibits at Kennedy Space Center acknowledge his contributions. The silence surrounding Baron extends beyond official records. Engineers and technicians who worked on Apollo have been remarkably reticent about Baron's accusations. Some have defended North American aviation's work. Others have remained silent. The conspiracy theory's author Bill Kaysing was one of the first to publicly suggest Baron's death was not accidental. Kaysing stated bluntly, "I believe that Thomas Ronald Baron was murdered because he had the truth to tell about the Apollo project." The theory suggested Baron had become too dangerous to NASA and its contractors. With his credibility established through congressional testimony, his continued presence posed a threat. If Baron had testified further, if he had continued speaking to the media, it could have ended the Apollo program entirely. According to this theory, elements within the government or defense contractors made the decision to silence Baron permanently. The train accident was staged to look accidental. The timing, exactly 1 week after congressional testimony, seemed too precise to be coincidental. If someone wanted to send a message to potential whistleblowers, the timing would serve that purpose. The disappearance of Baron's report added fuel to these theories. If it contained damning evidence of criminal negligence, then its disappearance could be seen as an attempt to bury evidence along with its author. Other researchers noted the pattern of deaths surrounding Apollo during the 1960s. Between 1964 and 1967, 10 astronauts died in various accidents, about 15% of NASA's astronaut corps. The clustering of fatalities raised eyebrows. Gus Grissom himself had been critical of NASA's management. His widow and son have stated their belief that the Apollo 1 fire was no accident, that it was deliberately set to eliminate Grissom. If true, Baron's death becomes part of a larger pattern of silencing critics. The counterargument skeptics point to several factors arguing against murder. First, Baron had already testified. The damage was done. His report was already with congressional investigators. Killing him after testimony wouldn't prevent information from coming out, it would only draw more attention. Second, the accident circumstances, while suspicious, aren't impossible to explain through human error. Baron could have been distracted, tired, or simply made a tragic misjudgment. Railroad crossing accidents, tragically, are not uncommon. Third, the report's disappearance, while strange, isn't necessarily evidence of cover-up. Congressional investigations generate enormous paperwork. Documents do get lost, especially in the 1960s. The chaos surrounding Apollo 1, with multiple committees involved, could have resulted in misfiling. Fourth, if NASA wanted to silence Baron, why wait until after his congressional testimony? Why not eliminate him quietly before he could speak publicly? Finally, the train engineer and witness would have to be conspirators or incredibly unlucky bystanders. The logistics of staging a train accident would be extraordinarily complex. Some historians argue that if Baron were murdered, it was more likely by private contractors protecting their reputations and contracts rather than NASA itself. However, even skeptics admit the timing troubles them. The legacy of unanswered questions today, more than 5 decades later, Thomas Baron remains a footnote in space history, known primarily to those who study Apollo 1 or follow conspiracy theories. There are no memorials to him at Kennedy Space Center. His name doesn't appear in standard Apollo histories. Most space enthusiasts have never heard of him. Yet his impact was significant. The safety issues he documented, the warnings he raised, contributed to the comprehensive redesign that ultimately made moon landings possible. Without the changes forced by Apollo 1, changes Baron had advocated for before the fire, it's questionable whether NASA could have safely reached the moon. The question of what really happened at that railroad crossing remains unanswered. The official ruling stands: accidental death. But the doubts persist. Was Thomas Baron murdered to protect NASA's program and the billions of dollars at stake? Or was he simply a victim of tragic accident that happened to occur at a suspicious time? We may never know the truth. Baron's 500-page report remains missing. The witnesses have either died or remained silent. The official files contain no smoking guns, no definitive proof. What we do know: Thomas Baron tried to prevent astronaut deaths. He documented failures, raised alarms, and risked his career to speak truth. 3 astronauts died in the fire he warned about. And 1 week after testifying, Baron himself died under circumstances never fully explained. Whether accident or murder, the effect was the same: silence. The most vocal critic of the Apollo program was gone. His comprehensive documentation disappeared with him. And NASA, freed from its most troublesome critic, went on to land men on the moon, achieving one of humanity's greatest triumphs, built in part on the warnings of a man who didn't live to see it happen. Baron's story serves as a reminder that whistleblowers take real risks when challenging powerful institutions. Whether his death was accident or murder, he paid the ultimate price for speaking truth to power. The truth about Thomas Baron's death remains somewhere out there, locked away in missing files, unspoken memories, and the cold silence of those who might know what really happened that night. His family members, in limited public statements over the years, have expressed doubts about the official ruling. While less vocal than the Grissom family, they've indicated that Thomas Baron's death felt wrong, the timing too convenient, his character too cautious, the circumstances too strange. Baron's legal representatives also expressed concerns. When they couldn't obtain his comprehensive report, they began asking questions. Why had such an important document disappeared? Who was responsible? What procedures prevented such losses? They received no satisfactory answers. The lack of investigation into the report's disappearance particularly troubled Baron's advocates. If truly lost through bureaucratic error, surely someone would be held accountable. Instead, the matter was quietly dropped. All we can do is remember his name, honor his courage, and continue asking the question he would have wanted us to ask: what really happened?